Aging and Public Policy at Economics in NUI Galway, and I'm the director of the Irish Centre for Social Gerontology. We're delighted that you can join us today, and we hope in this short session to give you a flavour of the programme and why this is such an important programme for the circumstances of ageing societies and the well-being, equity and sustainability of these societies as well. So I'm also delighted to be joined today by three of the lecturers from our programme. I suppose in many ways, all of whom, just adjust my camera, all of whom are experts in their own right in this field. So first we have Eamon O'Shea, who's Professor of Economics and Director of the Centre for Economic and Social Research and Dementia. Next, we have Anya Lema, who is Senior Research Fellow and Associate Director of the ICSG. And finally, we have Patricia Conboy, who is a consultant and adjunct lecturer with the ICSG and former head of global advocacy and campaigns for Help Age as well. Okay, so before we outline, I suppose, the structure of today's session, I want to remind us all, I suppose, a little bit very briefly about some of the key elements of our program and why essentially you should enroll in the program itself. So I guess we are very driven by the commitment to research-led interdisciplinary education, and as such, the program aims to critically examine demographic aging from a public policy perspective, and is very much driven by that commitment to assessing existing approaches, assessing future directions to secure effective and fair aging societies as well. So why are we interested in this? Well, it's a really important time for aging and policy, and there are three critical reasons as to why this program is necessary and why it's necessary now. And since we designed this program, I've been reiterating these reasons at different points, and I think over time they've actually strengthened as opposed to decreased in their significance and their importance. So first, and in almost all regions of the world, populations are aging, with the number of people aged 65 and over expected to double by 2050. And this creates, I suppose, very significant sustainability challenges for our systems and institutions, but also really important equity challenges for our societies in every major policy domain that you want to think about. Second, a range of major international, European and national policy agendas testify not just to the urgency of these challenges, but really importantly to the political commitment to finding innovative means to adapting to demographic change. So this is embedded within the UN Sustainable Development Goals. It's embedded within the European Commission's recognition of major transformations hitting Europe. And it's embedded within the new, well, it's not so much new now, it's a year old, European Commission's Green Paper on Aging as well. Third, and perhaps most critically, there is a marked gap very much in our labour force capacity, and particularly around the skills to help public agencies, civil society organisations and private companies to address these challenges and to capitalise on the opportunities within ageing societies as well. So as a result, existing efforts are often uncoordinated and ad hoc. And if you go onto our website, you'll see a series of testimonials from international stakeholders, from intergovernmental organizations, from governmental departments and so on, and from other academic and scholarly spheres that all essentially kind of support this idea that there is that marked gap there at the moment. And really the COVID-19 pandemic has only further exposed these weaknesses in aging related policy. And I suppose in some ways our neglect of the diversity of needs and preferences of heterogeneous aging populations, so very diverse groups of aging populations. So it's for this reason really that this interdisciplinary MSc program is designed to provide topic-specific and transferable skill sets through its combination of interdisciplinary taught modules, an applied research program, and a work placement. And I suppose what we're really kind of gearing towards is delivering expertise with respect to in-depth knowledge of aging-related policy as well as policy systems, a really important capacity for critical thinking and theorizing, the ability to assess and evaluate public policies, and the ability to apply research analytical methods to real-world policy challenges as well. Now, if you enroll in our program, we would hope that you would benefit very much from 3 distinctive features. So first is that the program is one of its first of its kind in Ireland and one of the first available internationally. Second, it is hosted by an internationally recognized research center in terms of the Irish Centre for Social Gerontology. We also have the Centre for Economic and Social Research on Dementia, which is a key aspect as well. And then the third element is that it's very much delivered in collaboration with international and policy experts and stakeholders. And Patricia is, I suppose, a representative of that sphere and that community as well. So I think we are now in our 2nd year of this program, and for this year's intake, we've expanded a number of optional modules to include those related to data analytics, to include those related to advocacy and social change. But we've also deepened the international perspectives within the program, and the forthcoming year we will have active contributions and guest lectures from expert colleagues from European and international centres, and here's just a couple of them on this slide. But we also hope to have very strong contributions from North American and some global South regions as well. As this is our 2nd year, I think it is important to give you a sense of student experiences. So we have 2 snippets of testimonials, one from our full-time students and from our part-time students as well. So we have Amy, who joined us from a undergraduate degree directly, and she's speaking about her experience there. And then we have Mary, who works within the sector and is completing the course part-time, and she's talking about her experience there as well. So if you again go to our website, you'll see some of these testimonials in the coming days, and you can get a better flavor of people's experiences. And this brings us then to today's taster section. So if you see me looking over here, I'm checking my timing to make sure I'm not running too long. And really, our focus here is to try and give you a flavor of some of the modules that you would be undertaking if you were to enroll in this program. And we have 4 mini lectures to reflect that. So first, I will give you a snippet, I suppose, of some critical considerations from a module on social exclusion and inequality across the life course. Then Eamon will look at some of the dynamics and some of the questions around home care, particularly forthcoming home care questions with respect to the dynamics of aging and public policy module. Anya will talk about extended working life and other elements of older workers' rights and entitlements and experiences as a reflection of her module on work, pensions and retirement. And Patricia will talk about mainstreaming aging and the UN Sustainable Development Goals in the context of low and middle income countries. And that's from a module on international policy and aging. And then hopefully at the end, we'll have some questions and answers. So please do send them in, whether it's more specific about these topics or whether it's about the structure of the program. Okay, so then on to the first of our mini lectures. And in my 10 minutes, I essentially want to speak to you about social exclusion and inequality in later life, but highlight some key considerations around these sort of challenges. So in this session, I want to first consider 4 main areas. So this is, why is inequality exclusion important for policy? What is meant by inequalities and exclusion as it's used in policy and as used in research? What are some of the unique features of disadvantage in later life that we might need to consider? And why do we need to think about considering the life course as a particular approach within policy and research that might add particular value to studying some of these questions as well? So firstly then, why is this important? Well, while I suppose there has been a general rise in standards of living of older populations in many countries, there's also evidence of increased variation of those living standards and increased variation in the quality and nature of life experiences of different groups of older people as well. And essentially this means that some people's lives are not improving as much as others, if at all, with growing inequalities amongst different older populations and amongst different nations as well. And this has occurred, I suppose, not just amidst demographic aging patterns, but also in terms of that changing relationships between societies and individuals, where provision, supports, and even employment is a little less certain and maybe sometimes a little bit more precarious for certain groups and certain cohorts. Therefore, I suppose what we can think about then is that unequal aging has not only impacted some of the current generation of older people, it has expected to not only, I suppose, undermines the moral equity, if we want to call it that, of aging societies, but leads to an accumulation of challenges that can be detrimental to individual households, detrimental to community contexts, and I suppose detrimental to the effectiveness of policy systems. And it also undermines any attempt to secure, major policy goals around, for instance, sustainable development, or for instance, around healthy and active aging, which is obviously a key consideration as well. Now that we've seen why this is important, what do we actually mean when we use terms like inequality and exclusion, particularly in relation to older people? Well, we can start first with just that base kind of idea, that base concept of inequality itself. And simply here, we can describe it as deficiencies and discrepancies in the full distribution of well-being across areas such as income, wealth, health, education, space, politics, and indeed identity. So this brings a number of things to our attention, or should bring a number of things to our attention. And the first is to need to ensure that there is an equivalence of resources and rights, that there's a fair distribution of power, and that there is a recognition of the worth and status of individuals. Now, traditionally, I suppose there has been a concentration in inequalities of outcomes, so differences between what people achieve, so it's health or income. But the focus very much has evolved over the years in terms of looking at the inequalities of opportunities, which is a little bit more processual and a little bit more kind of the root cause elements as well. And this is really about referring to people's circumstances with respect to how those outcomes, or what's the potential for different outcomes to be achieved. And I suppose the other big kind of transition that has happened here in terms of policy and research is that there's been a shift to trying to understand this as a multifaceted set of inequalities. So no longer are we just thinking about health and income, but we want to look at multifaceted forms of inequality in that respect. Sorry. And this brings us, I suppose, to the concept of social exclusion. And I think it's important to recognize that exclusion and inequalities are not necessarily the same thing, but certainly it does allow us to consider processes and outcomes that construct these inequalities and the ways in which these can change over time, and how these different sets of inequalities can contribute to entrenched forms of disadvantage and therefore, namely, the sort of experience of being excluded. So we can think very simply then of social exclusion as involving the separation of individuals and groups from mainstream society. And we need to think about this separation in material terms, so where people may struggle to gain access to certain things that they need on a daily basis, whether that's certain goods, services, or even employment. But we also need to think about it in terms of symbolic terms, so where our norms and practices could stigmatize and create positions of disadvantage for different groups. So, that pulls in questions around ageism and other aspects like that as well. I think for older people, there is a growing evidence base that points to how social exclusion can lead to inequities in choice and control, resources and relationships, and power and rights. And so it picks up some of the inequalities elements that we talked about earlier, but it can do this across, and hopefully this will work, slowly but surely it does, across interconnected economic, social, service, civic, socio-cultural, and neighborhood and community domains of daily life. So these are kind of areas that we live our lives in. These are kind of spheres that we engage in. So this illustrates why any policy that's interested in ensuring inequalities are addressed and exclusions and inequalities are addressed has to be multifaceted, has to be comprehensive, and has to reflect people's full participation in society in that respect as well. Now, as a research concept, social exclusion holds a number of really important conceptual attributes, if you want to think about that, that allows us to unpack some of these disadvantages. And this relates to how exclusion can be multidimensional, so essentially across all those different areas of life. It relates to how it can be dynamic and not static. So it's about trying to understand people's lives as they unfold and these processes of disadvantage as they might unfold as well. It's about being relative to context and to people's positions within society. So it matters where you live, because there's those kind of structures and norms that you live within that has a bearing on your circumstances. And it also involves then a perpetrated act of exclusion. And this is where we need to separate this idea of just participating to such a level or having access to such a level where we're looking for what are the reasons of that access, be it low or not. So it's about those unmet needs, it's about those disadvantages that are actually actively created. And we can go a little further here as well in thinking about how do these factors impact on older people specifically, what might be unique about later life in relation to these questions about inequality and exclusion. Well, as it's kind of pulls out here on the slide, we can think about this in a number of different ways. And the first is that certainly these exclusions can be accumulated over the life course, and that can ultimately contribute to an increased prevalence of exclusion into our older age. Second, as there are few ways for people to lift themselves out of exclusion in later life. So in other words, people may not have access to employment. They might also have other forms of resource deficiencies or any elements of that. Exclusion can have that more significant impact on people's lives and tip people who are very much okay into trajectories of precarity, so into circumstances that are not okay, I suppose, in that ways. And thirdly, well, some older individuals, and just some, mind you, can be impacted by these sorts of disadvantages and exclusion to a higher degree, and that's because of some age-related changes in health, but it's also because there can be a contraction of resources in later life, be it economic resources, be it social contact and social networks as well. So these are all things that influence our individual capacity to react and to circumvent these issues around exclusion as well. Okay, so I think as we consider some of these central kind of elements of exclusion, this really draws our attention not just to older age, but also to people's full lives. And our fourth area that we need to consider then is around life course approach, both in policy and both in research. And if nothing else, it gives you a good way to assess some policies and some elements around this. So ultimately, this is an approach that's advocated by many intergovernmental organizations, by many research scholars, but also people within national governments as well. So what we need to think about here is early life experiences and early life influences, and the need to intervene at different points across people's lives to better later life outcomes. We need to think about key transitions that can happen in later life, such as ill health, marital and family breakdown, issues around accommodation and housing uncertainty, and how then, in terms of combating entrenched inequalities that has already taken hold within the context of older people's lives, that there are certain things that we need to think about providing to address some of these accumulated inequalities. So this is about good quality health services, this is about good pension adequacy, it's about inclusive neighborhoods and environments, and it's about strong platforms for voices that enable people to express their own needs and exercise their own agency as well. Okay, so these are four areas that I wanted to cover. Now, what I would say is that there are a number of things that are related to those areas that COVID-19 has illustrated. I'll let you consider those yourself in relation to the statements that are put up here. But ultimately, the last 24 months has illuminated a number of different factors that we need to consider as we go forward into policy. And I think these are points that you can probably relate to and probably understand as well. And how maybe we haven't made it as far as we thought we did in terms of age-related policy and older people. Okay, so I suppose what I hope you've got from this very brief mini lecture is a number of key messages. So there are growing inequalities amongst some elements of older populations. We need to think about disadvantage in later life as being multidimensional and dynamic. And we need to think about specific features of exclusion in later life as well that we need to consider. And using a life course analytical frame can be helpful for unpacking some of these exclusions and some of these issues that we need to look at. So these are the sort of topics you would experience within this program on this module on social exclusion and inequality, and it's directly related then to the learning outcomes for this module, which is about construction and implications of exclusion, about the role of policy, and about our ways that we want to measure these elements as well. So thank you. That was our first mini lecture. And given our time considerations and everything else, I'd like to move directly now to our second mini lecture. So I would ask Eamon perhaps to share your slides, and I can introduce you as you're doing that. Okay, and I think, Eamon, we may not be able to see or hear you yet, so if you want to tick that on when you can as well. So Eamon is going to talk about the dynamics of aging and public policy module that he leads and coordinates, and specifically then on new directions in home care in Ireland.
Okay, I hope everyone can see my slides. Somebody will tell me if they can't. Okay, so I'm just going to...
Sorry, Eamon, we can see it, no problem. You can just put it on slideshow, I'd say.
Oh yeah, on slideshow, okay.
Perfect.
Okay, so I teach a course in dynamics of aging and public policy, and I just want to give, it's hardly fair to call them mini lecture. It's just some of the things that sort of the numbers encourage you to think. And the first slide up there is a slide titled Aging of Mortality Improvements. And really what's that showing is that things have got really good in terms of demography, in terms of, you know, there's been a lot of really positive changes over the last century in terms of, you know, life expectancy and gains in life expectancy for both males and females. I'm only showing the males picture right there at the moment. So what that table showed you is it's divided into periods starting in 1911 to 1936, right up to 2011 to 2015, over 100 years or so. And you can see that the major gains in the life century were mainly found for people at younger ages. So example, there was a 3.8-year gain in life expectancy during 1911-1926. At the other end, the age spectrum over 65, there was actually negative. So things were actually the major gain, for example, 1936 to 46, 2.3, and a major gain 1946 to 1961, nearly an 8-year gain in life expectancy for birth for males. But you see on the next gains in life expectancy for people who are at 65, it remained pretty static up to about 1991 in terms of from 65 on. You can see if you go right up to 1991, you can see that it only then did, in a sense, the gains in life expectancy begin to take off from age 65. And you can see in the right-hand column, that's on the third or the fourth column, the ratio of gains. You can see in recent decades, at the start of this century, the major gains in terms of have been in the 65 plus age category. So message is, or the picture is, major gains in life expectancy from birth, but not so much gains in the early parts of the 20th century, or indeed even across the 20th century from age 65 onwards. But in recent decades, you begin to see significant gains from 65 onwards, from age 65 onwards. This is major implications for policy. In other words, life expectancy is increasing, but life expectancy at 65 is really beginning now to show up in the data. People are living longer from 65 onwards. And you can see that in this short table here, or brief table here. This is life expectancy at 65 for 3 years, 1990, 2006, and 2016. So in 1990, you can see that males, a male in 1990, on average, obviously, was expected to live 30 years. A woman was expected to live 17 years. And that has increased to 2016, the last available year that we have data for. Life expectancy is 65 now. For a male is 18 years, and for a woman it's increased to 21 years. So there's a lot of living to do when you reach 65, and that's really the good news story in terms of demography, in terms of, you know, mortality has gone down, and the mortality decrease has been mainly due to changes, for example, in cardiovascular disease and respiratory disease. But, you know, increases in income per capita. Ireland has also become a richer country. That has had an influence on mortality. And so there's been major mortality improvements, but life expectancy, you can see that number of years there. And if you think about it, you know, when we think back about our own life course, you know, that means that really, if you think, you know, from the sort of standard year of retirement at 65, and that's on average, so many people live much longer. So that's a big chunk of life to live, but it's also a big chunk of life for policymakers to be interested in. It's certainly, if you like to that expression, it's cool to be old, because it seems to be everybody wants to be old. Look at the Irish Fiscal Council age cohort growth projections. You know, 241% an increase in the 80 plus is expected, an 88% increase expected. And you can contrast that to the expectation of the increase in the lower ages, you know, 3% 0 to 14, 2% 15 to 24, and only a 6% increase in that period. So we're going to get major growth. Not everybody necessarily thinks like that. If you look at the Irish Fiscal Council, or particularly for public policy, it certainly is a great news story, but it has implications. And the major implications are, of course, for policy, for pensions and for healthcare. If you look at the Irish Fiscal Council projections, for example, spending increase as a percentage of GNI, the amount of money resources spent on pensions will increase from 8% up to 12% of gross national income. Sizable chunk of gross national income being redistributed towards pensions. Similarly with healthcare, an increase from 8% to 13%. So the good news story in terms of mortality down, aging, life expectancy increase, especially for 65, increase in the numbers of older people. It has policy implications. It's very important, I think, not just to first of all welcome that sort of gains that all of us, and hope all of us or some of us experience in terms of into older age, but it of course it has policy implications, and part of the course will be looking at these policy implications, as Kieran has said, in terms of both pensions and healthcare, other social protection, and so on. But you can see that that's why the discussion and why this story is so interesting, and will become even more interesting over the next 30 years or so, because of the implications of pensions and health and social care for older people. And that's why retirement age is now a major policy focus. And one of the reasons is simply because working lives have not kept pace with the increase in life expectancy. In other words, if you in some sense officially cut off working life at a particular age, and people are living much longer and further behind that beyond that age, then there's going to be implications because for pensions. When public pensions were introduced at the start of the 20th century, people weren't expected to live much longer than when the pensions kicked in. Now that's demonstrably not true. People can live another 20 years and more. So the length of retirement has increased significantly for people, again, which is a good story. But this has led policymakers in many countries, including Ireland, to consider raising the normal retirement age in an effort to further extend working lives. Even France is beginning to think about extending the pension, or reducing the age of pension. So the aim is simply to reduce public expenditure and increase tax revenue. That's the sort of pared down version of this story, obviously, which is a lot more nuanced. But all countries are worrying about public expenditure that is linked to sort of changes in your retirement age and changes in pensions. So, for example, you have mandatory enrollment. In Ireland began this mandatory enrollment system in a private pension for people entering the labour market, and so on. Also discussions about do we raise the retirement age to 68, which is now decided against. Do we think about increasing the retirement age generally? So all of these are really important policy questions that sort of this course will address. And importantly, from the point of view of your own engagement in a course like this, will not be going away anytime soon, and will require a lot of thought and a lot of analysis over the next 20, 30 years, and input from people like yourselves or graduates from this course. It's really important, in a sense, to try to make sense of these kind of complex socio-political decision-making, socio-cultural decision-making in regard to pensions, working lives. What's the optimal level of support? What's the intergenerational solidarity associated with our pension system? And what are the arguments for increasing the retirement age? What are the counter arguments for not increasing the retirement age? And we've seen some of these are political arguments. Some of these relate to also, pension changes will have differential changes on people who work in manual occupations, people who have occupational pensions, people who have private pensions, people who are well off, people who choose to retire, those who don't choose to retire, people who retire unhealthy, with ill health course will try to attend and address. And similarly with health and social care, I mean, the recent capacity report, the 2018 capacity report from Department of Health, had a nice table. By 2031, that's only 10 years away, over 65 will generate half of all healthcare activity. And the next 10 years will see a 46% increase in demand for primary care, 39% increase in demand for residential care beds, 70% increase in demand for home care, and 24% increase in demand for non-elective inpatient episodes in public hospitals. And again, these are sizable potential changes over the next 10 years or so, which planners have to take account of, and that's what the capacity report is doing, trying to make plans for these kind of changes. And that's essentially partly premised on the sort of shifting costs and shifting care away from hospital care to primary care to community-based care, because you're going to find increased demand for health and social care over the next 10 years. And of course, this course will this program addresses these questions straight on in terms of the losers here over the next 10 years. And all this is predicated on an economy that's, as you can see, has never gone away, for example, but increasing the inflationary pressures now and the potential possibility of an international recession arising from war. And if that happens, the next 10 years may not provide as much potentially public resources than, for example, the last 10 years, even the last 10 years with a recession at the start. If you remember back 2008, Ireland certainly went some way to protecting the incomes of the less well off, both at the beginning in the recession in 2008, 9, 10, and also then subsequently in the pandemic. You may agree or disagree, but certainly there were resources there to do that. That certainly may not be the case if some of the more pessimistic projections with regard to the economy come true. So the continuum of care then is a really important part of the work I do in terms of thinking about dementia in particular, but also thinking about dependency.
Eamon, I'll just ask you to maybe finish up just within a minute, if that's okay. And I should have said that I'd give you a notification as we went along. Thank you. Yeah,
okay. So the continuum of care then is in terms of big question coming up, for example, is staunch care, and also the development of new home care legislation, which will again try to transfer the focus of care from residential care to home care. And all of that is because shifting the sort of locus of care from residential care to home care will require a major shift in not only resources, but a major shift in thinking and in the way we organize and deliver care. And that's a really interesting area to think about and work in and research on and to explore. And part of that will throw up some interesting issues about generational relationships. But if we begin to shift care to home care, there will be interesting implications for family care, interesting implications for the way we fund long-term care, for example. And I think issues on future funding models will be a major issue and an interesting, a major focus for what I teach. Finally, then, in terms of the learning outcomes, look.
Okay, I think we've just lost.
Demography is really important, as we see. Even the first slide I put up there shows you.
Okay, I think Eamon, we're losing you signal-wise.
Okay, so I can finish. I mean, I finished up there. That's fine. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, thanks very much, Eamon. And apologies there. I think the signal was interrupted at different points. It probably was for us here, but hopefully for you, wherever you are, you got to hear everything Eamon was saying there. So thanks very much, Eamon. And that has given a really comprehensive view of some of the issues you'll be dealing with within the context of your module. So then I might just shift then to Anya Lema. So Anya, if you want to share your screen there, please, and switch on your camera as well, that would be great.
And unmute.
And unmute, yes, indeed. So Anya will be talking about work, pensions and retirement, and just giving you an overview of some of the elements that she'll be picking up within that module. So if you want to hit slideshow there, Anya, and you'll have 10 minutes, and I'll give you an indication again as we're approaching the end.
Great. Okay, thanks very much, Kieran. And so I'm going to be talking about the module on work, pensions and retirement. And so I'm also based at the Irish Centre for Social Gerontology, and there will be some guest lectures as well on this module. So Eamon has kind of set it up very nicely for me, because I'll be picking up on some of those issues he mentioned there in relation to policy. So first I'm going to give you kind of a broad outline. This is the structure of this mini lecture. So first we're going to be looking at patterns and of older workers and where they're based across. This will be an international overview of work patterns and so on. Then we'll look at why is it important to look at older workers and pensions and retirement? Why is that important for policy? And you'll find that it's really just a very live space at the moment in policy. Eamon mentioned it, and I'll go into it in a bit more detail because I'm going to give you an example of extended working life, just to give you an idea of what we will do in the course. The other important thing about this is that we'll be adopting critical perspectives. So there's a gender, political, economy of aging perspective, and which it kind of questions existing policies and so on. Looking at events in the economy, looking at the differences between men and women and how they are placed in the labour market, and other groups of workers as well. So that is, I'm just leading on into inequalities across groups and over the life course. So people working in different types of jobs. So those could be either physically demanding or very stressful jobs. And then how there's intersections between inequalities across the life course. So, for example, if people have been involved in caring earlier in their lives, they may not have built up the pension contributions that they need to have a full state pension, for example, and this is a very international course, really, both in terms of what drives extended working life policy. So there are supranational organizations like the OECD and to a lesser extent the European Union. So we'll look at their policies and how they encourage governments to adopt particular policies through what's called soft governance. And then we look at considerations for the future. So what might policy look like in the future? Okay, so older workers' pensions and retirement, as Eamon has said, that really is driven by population aging and the whole question of how do we sustain public pensions if people are living for longer. So those two questions of sustainability and adequacy of pensions. So we look at where does Ireland stand, in terms of pension adequacy, comparing it to other European and OECD countries. And what does it mean for future workers? So what's happening in terms of policy trends is they're increasing state pension age in most countries. So does this mean that people will be working until age 70? And what does that mean, literally, what does it mean for people's lives? So we'll be looking at a variety of different types of evidence on that. There'll be the quantitative, but also qualitative from a lot of research that we have done recently. And, I think that really heightens the understanding of what these type of policies can mean for people. We look at the current debates in Ireland, which are really interesting because when they first introduced extended working life, it was hardly noticed really. So it's very interesting to see how the debate emerged from then to protests and so on at increasing state pension age. And then we look at that, particularly, as I said, at extended working life policies and then at auto enrolment. Which is that pension policy where people are automatically enrolled into a pension as soon as they start work, and they have to opt out if they want to. We'll be looking not only at government policy, because that's only one side of it, but also employers' policies. So because depending on the industry or the particular job that people are working in, the employers can really set when people can retire. Currently, people in Ireland, their retirement age is set by their contracts that they entered into when they started work. So we have to see what, is there any onus on employers to give them employment, because ageism is another something that's really important to look at, because even people may want to work or people may have to work for financial reasons, but that doesn't mean that employers want to employ them. So we'll look at that, some evidence on that as well. So as I mentioned there, there's the international phenomenon of population aging is what really kicked off this, and makes this so interesting at the moment. And then you have the OECD. They set out in 2006. They wrote "Live Longer, Work Longer," which kind of is what it says on the tin. And they publish scorecards for each country. So that's what I meant by soft governance. So people, to see whether the governments have increased state pension age and so on, or brought in any policies that will help older workers to remain in employment. And that's at the international level. So they publish these scorecards every few years. And the national policy then in Ireland, they really took that on and increased state pension age to 66 and then 67 and 68. Well, they planned to do that very, very quickly, and they're more in line with countries with much older populations, such as Germany. And Ireland still has a relatively young population compared to other OECD countries. But it's very topical, as I said, because there were a lot of protests when people realized the implications for them of increasing state pension age. It was introduced in 2012, but people only began to feel the impact of it when they had to keep working longer or just didn't get their pension until for another year. And that was due to happen in 2021. So there were so many protests in prior to the 2020 election that the Pensions Commission was set up and to report, and they reported in 2021. And they advised a much slower increase, in more gradual increase in state pension age. And but the government still has to respond to that. So, and it's such a difficult issue. It'll be very interesting to see what they do. As this course was going on this year, we kept waiting for the government to respond to the Pensions Commission report, which was due to happen in March, but it didn't happen yet. So this all shapes work patterns, and the whole issue of well-being for older workers is really interesting as well. And well-being in retirement. So we'll have a look at that. So the well-being for older workers. So are there policies, for example, that employers bring in? Are there differences in policies for different types of work? And if people don't have adequate pensions, where does that leave them? So up to last year, they had to go on job seekers allowance when they were past 65 or 66, but that's been changed now. They have a different kind of a scheme. It's like it's not a pension, but it's some kind of an allowance. Okay, so this is just to illustrate. These are people who are in very rewarding jobs. They're on the left, and really enjoy and want to keep doing those jobs. And then on the right here, you have people in manual jobs or, repetitive jobs. So they're subject to, repetitive strain injury and things like that. There's a lot of evidence that people in manual jobs just are, they have a lot of musculoskeletal injuries by the time they're, in their early 60s, really. So it's very difficult for them to continue working. So the other thing about this extended working life policy, I said I'd look at it in more detail. It's often seen as a neoliberal policy, and so it's about cutting back the welfare state and reducing costs. And the main policy measure that they recommend is that increase in state pension age. But the problem is that's a one-size-fits-all approach. And those, I mentioned there, I showed you the photo of those in physically demanding versus very, very interesting jobs. But there's also people in precarious employment. So for them, they may not have a continuous pension record. And it's often very difficult for them to get jobs as well if they're made redundant at at around the age of 60. And particularly if they're in low-paid work, they won't have been able to pay into private pensions. So the other very interesting aspect is there are very obvious existing pension inequalities that I mentioned about women who are involved in caregiving, or even there was just a norm for women to be more in the home. So there are big differences. Women are much more likely to be dependent on the non-contributory state pension for that reason. So this is what I mentioned about the pension reforms. So you have the figures there. It was increased to 66 in 2014 and was to increase to 67 last year, and then to 68 in 2028. So I think that's pushed out. It's not even going to start increasing. Well, sorry, that's what the Pensions Commission recommends. It's not going to start increasing until after 2028, and then it's going to increase more gradually. So the other policies that were brought in that would affect this are anti-age discrimination policies, which they've been strengthened over the years. But the OECD. Sorry, am I going on too long?
No, you're right. No, just if you finish up in the next minute, that'd be great. Thank you.
No problem. Okay, so the point here really is that there's a code of practice for employers, but it's not binding, whereas the increase in state pension age would be binding. So it's kind of, there's an inequality really in the types of legislation that's there. I mentioned about the debates and the Pensions Commission and the government response. So the learning outcomes from this are an understanding of the main policy issues and debates, the international context and policy drivers. And really, what's really important here is the ability to critically analyze policies using critical theories of aging, the gender political economy of aging approach, but also the life course approach. As you'll notice, I mentioned how people end up in a certain position approaching state pension age. It's another thing that students did value from this year is there's both quantitative and qualitative evidence, and that really brings this whole issue to life. The prospects for the future and to have an integrated approach to policy and look at good practices internationally. So that's the introduction really to work pensions and retirement.
Thanks very much, Anya. I appreciate that. That's again a very comprehensive overview and some of the key issues there pulled out for us. So Anya, I might ask you to stop sharing your screen, and Patricia, then moving on to our final mini lecture. Patricia, if you can share your screen and switch on your camera, and we can see if everything is working okay. That's great. Okay, and just while Patricia is unmuting and switching on everything, so Patricia is going to talk about international policy and aging across the life course, and that's the module that Patricia coordinates, and then is going to be focusing on sustainable development goals and that question about mainstreaming aging as well. So Patricia, please, whenever you're ready.
Thanks so much, Kieran. So good morning to everyone online. I am one of 3 contributors to this module on policy and aging across the life course. To give you a flavour of the content, I'm focusing today on some aspects of mainstreaming aging in international policy, and that is ensuring an age equality and inclusion perspective is incorporated in all stages of the policy process and at all levels. Up to last year, as you've heard earlier, I worked with Help Age International, so as head of global aging and advocacy. So I'm bringing a particular focus on the experience of aging and older people in low and middle incomes to this module. Just one sec. So in terms of our outline for today, we are going to look at the case of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Going to make some general points about older age exclusion in low and middle income countries, identify some of the challenges experienced by older people in those settings during COVID, draw out some policy considerations and make some observations for the future. In terms of the significance of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, it is the world's action plan on poverty, which was agreed at the UN in 2015. It is global. It's applicable in all countries, high, middle, and low income countries. It's inclusive of all ages, with 17 Sustainable Development Goals and a central pledge to leave no one behind. It's a global framework with national implementation and relies on voluntary review and reporting by governments. The inclusion of all ages in this international framework is really important. The United Nations is now shifting, and there are many multilateral agencies, but traditionally the UN has not been strong on the mainstreaming of aging and older people. Now, with the 2030 Agenda, you have UN bodies, donor agencies, governments, aid programs, aligning their strategies and their narratives to the 2030 Agenda. So it has the potential to advance policy mainstreaming of aging and older people at global and national levels. And of course, the critical question is, to what extent is that potential being utilised? A few comments on older age exclusion in low and middle income countries, and a note of information that income categories for countries are determined by the World Bank on the basis of gross national income per capita. Globally, as Kieran referred to earlier, we are seeing major demographic transition. Over outnumbered children aged 5 and under. Currently, the largest share of older people in the world lives in Southeast Asia and East Asia, and this is the region where population aging is happening at the fastest pace. And these challenges, as Eamon and Anya have been outlining, do bring challenges for, or these changes do bring challenges for policymakers, but with foresight and planning, it is possible to adapt societal systems so that they work for people of all ages. Now, of course, older people in low and middle income countries are not a homogeneous group, and there is tremendous diversity in circumstances across geographies, economies, and cultures. So I'm asking you just to bear with me while I speak in shorthand for the purposes of the taster lecture today. Nonetheless, we have the evidence to show that there are clear patterns in terms of lack of access to rights, to income, to health services, to humanitarian supports for older people in many diverse settings in low and middle income countries. And of course, we have interaction between demographic aging and global megatrends and issues such as migration and displacement. We're seeing it in Ukraine at the moment, climate change and COVID-19, which I'm going to go on and speak about now, having an impact on how people age now and in the future. In terms of older people's experiences during COVID-19, again, just being very selective in terms of what I present this morning. When we were working together in HelpAge, I categorized risks to older people in 3 groups. So the first group of risks related to health, both direct from death and disease. We know how older people were more susceptible to COVID, but also indirectly as health services in low and middle income countries, as indeed here in Ireland, were redirected and reoriented to respond to the pandemic and move away from people's underlying conditions, etc. The second category related to what were thought of as indirect impacts to do with income insecurity and food insecurity. And those concerns actually dominated the agenda in relation to discussion about policy and response in low and middle income countries. And the third category of risk was actually global, but we experienced it also in relation to low and middle income countries, which was, and Kieran has touched on this, the high tolerance for ageism, discrimination, issues in relation to statistical gaps for information planning, misinformation. All of those kinds of issues posed real challenges for older people in terms of COVID-19. The ILO figures show that pension coverage is less than 20% for people of pension age in low-income countries, compared with 68% globally. So you're talking, we're looking now at that second category of risks. And you're talking about older people with fragile livelihoods, those, many of them actually working in the informal sector, highly exposed, and during COVID then reliant on family support. And we know families were under tremendous pressure everywhere due to lockdowns and public health measures, necessary as they may have been. And older people then also experienced grave difficulties, we found in HelpAge research, in accessing the emergency cash transfer schemes that were set up by governments during COVID. So these would typically have been targeted at wider groups in the population, issues to do with lack of ID, problems with enrolment, lack of information, lack of clarity about eligibility, and in particular, digital barriers where it was a requirement to either register or access the payment digitally. And of course, older people in low and middle income countries, digital access is a real issue, real concern. So in terms then of policy considerations to do with both Agenda 2030 and COVID-19 and some of the experiences there, which I've tried to run together. There's a real gap between the vision of 2030, the 2030 agenda, and policy implementation, both at global and at national levels. And there are real challenges in actually quantifying the issues that are impeding policy implementation and compiling that information from the disparate experiences of older people in very, very different settings. But some of it has to do with the limited of the challenge in terms of implementation, has to do with the limited visibility of older people in reporting and monitoring of the SDGs and indeed of COVID-19. So there are 17 SDGs, there's a massive sort of indicator database, but the targets and indicators to measure progress frequently do not count older people or reflect their experience. And this in turn is linked to underlying deficits in statistical systems where older people may be uncounted, or the data for older people aged 60 and over is not disaggregated, not publicly reported or disseminated. And there are real issues in terms of the deepening of some of those problems in relation to data during COVID-19, when collection of data actually went online. And again, older people were more restricted in terms of online access. So all of this leads to troubling deficits in terms of evidence-informed policy making, both pre-pandemic and during the pandemic, due to gaps in the statistical systems we've spoken about, due to failure to apply gerontological research knowledge, such as the kind of issue and material that and analysis that Kieran was bringing into his introduction earlier to this session, and due to gaps in policymakers' appreciation of the lived experience of older people. So, for example, in relation to older people in low and middle income settings, many of the international agencies coming in, the key people will come in with an idea that older people are economically unproductive, they're past it, they've left the labour force or whatever. In fact, they're community first responders, they're community workers, they're heavily engaged in all aspects of lives in their local settings. So, and finally then, older people themselves are often unaware of their rights, unaware of commitments that governments have made on their behalf through these international frameworks, therefore less able to hold governments to account. And those issues, again, the challenges deepened during COVID, where it was harder for people to meet, where the people, activists who were working with older people were relying on online methods to try and elicit their experience. And so some of the platforms that people had for advocacy and engagement were actually lost or not functioning at that time, though obviously that's changing again now, thank goodness. So in terms of looking to the future, where does all of this take us? And I suppose what I would say is that in principle, all post-COVID preparedness, response and recovery strategies should be age inclusive. And that's really clear messaging that needs to come from the core out in terms of the UN and right through all of the multilateral agencies that are then involved in these processes in low and middle income countries. There's a call everywhere, not just in low and middle income countries, for the renewal of the social contract between governments and people. The 2030 agenda remains salient. So whilst we've had slippage on SDG targets, including for the first time ever, the first time in the last 20 years, I think it is, an increase in poverty, global poverty, it still provides scope to drive policy action on social protection, universal health coverage, access to digital technologies, and addressing data gaps. There is a global opportunity to challenge ageism via the UN Decade of Healthy Aging, which has now been agreed by the General Assembly and is running till 2030. There's, the jury, we're at the early stages, but the WHO has led the development of a joint plan with 12 UN agencies on how they can work to advance healthy aging, including action on ageism, and at country level and with governments. Now, that plan is not yet in the public domain. I believe it should be, and I hope that in time we can bring that about. So all of this that I've spoken about here in this last slide relates to work led by governments and institutions. Essential for progress on mainstreaming is that civil society activism in terms of campaigning, advocacy, engagement is effective, that it is cross-sectoral, not in silos, and that it directly involves older people. Finally, that when we speak about older people always, and I think all of my colleagues on the panel would say with me, that when it comes to older people, nothing about us without us. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Patricia. And again, some great insights there into the module and into the topic and some of the really big issues that that you'll be dealing with. So I'm just going to close the session now, but I'm going to close the session with just a couple of questions that we've received in. So firstly, for further information on the course itself, you can go to this link here. To the program on aging and public policy. You can also see and visit the ICSG website, and you'll see some of the themes that we do some work on, as well as some of the key outputs. So, for instance, on the left-hand side there of the screen, you can see work in relation to social exclusion and critical transitions, and these are kind of research briefing papers that we will put out for lay audiences. And then on the right-hand side, there is some work there around home care and life course aspects for older travelers and older homeless adults, but there's many more elements picking up on some of the questions there that people were dealing with. And finally, you'll see some broader text that you can really get into and access mostly for free and mostly online if you want to do that as well. So please do go to those websites. So then for the questions that have come in, so a couple of these are just course related. The first one is just about can we do the course online? So yes, the course is delivered in a hybrid dual mode model, if you like, which is the fancy way of saying that we want an in-person class and a remote class as well, and that's what we facilitated this year. And what we worked very hard to try and do is to make sure that that functions as one whole entire class. So if you're remote accessing the class, we will ask you to lock into that for the term. And similarly, notwithstanding any other public health crisis, if you're in person, we would try and ask you to do that as well. And then the idea is that people are very much engaged with each other, and we facilitate in-person and remote discussions as we go along. The other question is, so there was two questions just around the online element. The other question then is around the backgrounds of students. So it's very much an interdisciplinary program. So we have students who were engaged last year and who were interested in this year from economics, from sociology, politics, and kind of public policy and social policy areas. We have students from kind of allied health sciences. So that's health and social care provision directly, as well as social care. And then we also have people who are working directly within the sector. So this year, again, we had a very nice divide between part-time and full-time students. So I think one of the big benefits is that actually people who are working in the sector have so much more knowledge to share with the class, and depending on career stages and everything else, there's a really nice dynamic there. So I think that's really important as well. And then the last question just on the general structure is, what is the structure of the modules across the main year? So to give you a very quick sense, In term 1, you will take Dynamics of Aging and Public Policy, which is that introduction to that big policy questions that Eamon will do. You will take my module on social exclusion and inequality, and then you will take a research methods module, which is really trying to unpack different kinds of research approaches and analytical approaches as well. In term 2, you will take Patricia's module on international policy and aging across the life course. Anya's on work pensions and retirement. We'll also take another module on health systems and policy analysis. And then, and my screen might switch here for a second just to remind myself of all the optional modules. We have a number of different optional modules. This includes one that's specific in environmental gerontology and aging in place. It includes then more analytical methods modules around systematic review, around cost benefit analysis, around data analytics for social science. And there is a law module and a social and political context of activism module as well. And we are adding another one, so we'll finalize that, and then we'll be sending out timetables to those students already enrolled as well. Okay, so the final question that I'll take here, because I'm conscious of the time, is this one is more a cross-cutting one, so that's why I picked it out. And it's in relation to which of the topics that we've covered today are the most important for aging and policy into the future. So straight away, I think you're going to try and start a fight amongst us. But I think overall, they're very much interconnected in terms of what people have talked about, and it's probably just which levels we want to engage in. But what I want to do is just maybe open that up very quickly to anybody on the panel who might be an interest in or a particular view on what they think might be important for the next 10 to 20 years. So would anyone like to contribute to that? Patricia.
Yes, what strikes me, I think all of the topics are important, but I think I would pick up what you said at the very beginning, Kieran, which that thinking in terms of aging policy and bringing that holistic and cross-cutting approach to it, I think is really important. The life course is really important. And the most important thing I would think is, what's your perspective? And mine, unapologetically, is a rights perspective. So it's not a paternalistic or a charity-based perspective. There are some thoughts from me. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Patricia. Anybody else?
Well, of course, I'd have to say work pensions and retirement. No.
Highly original.
No, I think, well, for me, it's really important to have a critical perspective, and it's, as Patricia was saying there, like an integrated perspective. Even if you're looking at, say, things like precarity, it's not only about work, it's also about housing and income and so on. So it's really important to look across policy areas. Those are my two things.
Okay, great. And Eamon, I'll leave the final word to you if you want to add anything.
Yeah, just briefly, the economy is going to be the critical thing over the next decade, 2 decades. I think we've been spoiled a little bit that it's taken a back seat, but I think the economy will really be important for resource allocation. And within that, then choices, of course, continually have to be made. And I think that'll raise interesting intergenerational and questions. It'll also raise interesting public policy questions as to within aging, what matters most. And I think for me, that's the real crux of the matter is, will we have enough money? And with the money we have, how will we spend it?
Mm. Okay, and I think that gives us really good food for thought, and hopefully it does for yourselves as well who are watching. So thank you all for bearing with us and for being with us here today. As I said, we will be putting up the materials on the website. That'll take us maybe a day or so to get those up, but please do visit our website or contact us if you have any questions. So again, thank you to all the audience, but also thank you to all the panelists that we've had, Patricia, Anya and Eamon. Thanks very much, and we'll see you soon again. Take
Sorry,
care.
Kieran, we do have one more question there.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Sorry, could you do this while working full time? So yes, you can. Sorry, there's a question about whether or not we offer the course part-time. And yes, we offer the course as a part-time program. So the structure of modules there that I listed out, essentially you'll be doing half of those in year 1 and half in year 2. And again, half of our program this year are part-time students. So if you have any specific questions about that, please do let me know. And we will be finalizing timetables in the next week or so. So if you're interested, we can always send those on to you. They'll just be indicative, but they'll give you a sense of what we're doing. Okay, listen, thanks so much. And we'll see you again soon. Take care. Bye-bye.